What if the man who hates you the most became the only person capable of protecting you? Rosanna was sold, forced into a cold, loveless marriage, handed over to a man who promised never to touch her, but also never to let her go. Alex saw her as a burden, a reminder of the past that he had sworn to destroy. But what he didn't expect was that this woman, whom he despised, was the only one capable of changing everything. Hatred, desire, betrayal, and a secret that destroys any certainty. When Rosanna runs away and disappears for 5 years, Alex thinks he's finally rid of her, but what he finds when he meets her again is the truth he feared most. She didn't run off on her own. She took something from him, something he would never leave behind. And now there's no escape. The white silk dress weighed on her skin like invisible chains. The mirror in front of her reflected the image of a soulless bride, her eyes dull and her lips pressed into a thin line. Rosanna slid her trembling fingers through the lacy fabric, feeling as if she were touching her own sentence. She didn't want it. She didn't want to be there. But it had never been her choice. Her father, Henry, had made that decision without hesitation. An unpayable debt, a cold negotiation, a contract sealed without your opinion being taken into account. The only thing that mattered was saving his own name, and Rosanna was the price to be paid. Her fate had been sold to a man who didn't even want her. She could hear the voices outside the room, the muffled murmurs of the guests, the sounds of glasses clinking, the hurried footsteps of the staff. The world kept spinning as if nothing was wrong, as if this wedding was a celebration and not a punishment. The door opened unceremoniously and a woman rushed in. It's time. The knot tightened in Rosanna's throat. Her feet moved by sheer inertia, carrying her down the aisle for the long walk to the altar. Each step echoed in her mind as a cruel reminder of her powerlessness. She looked up and saw him. Alex, the man she had been handed over to. The dark suit seemed molded to his body, his expression impassive, as if none of this concerned him. His eyes were fixed on her, but without a trace of emotion. Rosanna wasn't expecting affection, but the ice in his gaze was an unexpected blow. Next to her, the priest began the ceremony. The words echoed like a distant hum. In joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health. Nothing seemed real. The air in his lungs heaved, the room spun around him, and by the time he realized it, it was too late. Yes, the word escaped his lips. And then everything was sealed. The hall was lit by huge chandeliers. The guests were toasting, smiling, and dancing. To anyone on the outside, it was a perfect wedding. But for Rosanna, it was a stage set, a well-rehearsed farce. She was sitting at the main table, her gaze lost in the bottom of her wineglass. Alex, next to her, seemed even more distant than during the ceremony. His jaw clenched, his fingers sliding leisurely down the glass of whiskey. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word, and somehow that hurt more than any insult he could have hurled at her. She waited for him to say something, anything. But the silence between them was thick, overwhelming. Guests came up to the table, congratulated the couple, paid them empty compliments about what a beautiful pair they made. Rosanna just smiled out of obligation, feeling her heart wither a little more with each word. Then, as if his patience had run out, Alex stood up without saying a word. He picked up his glass and walked out onto the balcony, leaving Rosanna behind, alone among the forced smiles. She watched him leave, her chest tight with a mixture of anger and frustration. That was as far as her submission went. She took a deep breath and stood up too. She walked towards him, determined. The cold night breeze made her body shiver, but she didn't care. Alex stood with his back to her, staring at the illuminated city below. His profile was stern, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "Why do you hate me so much?" He didn't turn around immediately. For a moment she thought he would ignore her, but then the answer came, sharp as a blade. Because you're part of what I despise most. The words hit Rosanna like a punch. You don't even know me. Finally, Alex turned around. His dark eyes locked onto her, analyzing her as if trying to decipher something he didn't want to understand. I don't need to know you. I know where you come from. I know the blood that runs through your veins. And that's enough. Rosanna felt a bitter taste in her mouth. Then why did you accept this marriage? If you despise me so much, why didn't you refuse? He smiled, but there was no humor in the gesture. Because some wars aren't won with rejection, but with possession. Rosanna's blood ran cold. Alex didn't want her. He possessed her, and that thought was more frightening than anything else. The night was cold, but no colder than the look on Alex's face as he left the balcony and went back into the mansion. Rosanna stood there for a few moments, staring at the horizon as if the night air could calm her, but there was no relief. There was no peace, just a whirlwind inside her that threatened to suffocate her. She entered the mansion with measured steps, holding her head high even as she felt every eye on her. The dress weighed her down, but nothing compared to the weight of the forced marriage that now bound her to a man who hated her. She climbed the stairs, her heart pounding as she approached the room she would now share with Alex. She stopped in front of the door, hesitated for a second before turning the knob. The suite was huge, luxurious, but impersonal. Cold walls, refined furniture, but no trace of welcome. No flowers, no candles, no detail that could make the room even remotely romantic. The white dress slid down her body as she undid the last buttons, falling to the floor like a symbol of the prison she had been thrown into. She put on a satin robe over the delicate lingerie and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap. The door opened behind her. Rosanna didn't turn around, but felt Alex's presence fill the room. He approached her slowly, without saying a word. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end when he stopped close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. Don't kid yourself. His voice broke through the heavy air. You can have my surname, you can wear that wedding ring, but you'll never be my wife. The coldness in his voice pierced her like a blade. Alex spun on his heels and walked away to a closet. He grabbed a towel and went into the bathroom, without so much as another glance in her direction. Rosanna remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor. Then only the sound of water running in the shower remained in the room. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the bed for hours, staring at nothing. Time dragged on, and the silence in the house seemed more deafening than any screams. When she finally gave in to tiredness and went to bed, sleep didn't come. In the morning, the sun seeped through the curtains, heralding a new day that seemed even crueler than the last. Rosanna got up and put on something simple before going down to breakfast. The table was full, but the atmosphere was just as chilly as the night before. Alex was already there, reading a newspaper while drinking his coffee. He didn't look at her when he sat down opposite her. She picked up a cup, taking a deep breath before finally breaking the silence. How long do you intend to treat me like a ghost? Alex slowly lowered the paper, resting his eyes on her. Until you understand that that's exactly what you are to me. Rosanna's heart squeezed. She knew that this marriage would never be a fairy tale, but Alex's coldness was worse than anything she could have imagined. She pushed back her chair and stood up, her chest heaving with restrained anger. If that's how it's going to be, then get ready, because I'm not a shadow. Alex arched an eyebrow. She leaned over the table, holding the cup firmly in her hands. If you want to ignore me, you're going to have to try harder, because I'm not going to be erased. She turned on her heels and left the room before he could reply. His heart was pounding. If Alex thought he could destroy her with his indifference, he was sorely mistaken. The sound of her own footsteps echoed down the corridor as Rosanna left the dining room. Anger pounded in her chest like a drumbeat. Ever since she had been forced into this marriage, she had been treated like a burden, a ghost to be ignored. But she wouldn't allow Alex to erase it. She spent the afternoon walking around the estate trying to clear her head. Every corner of the mansion oozed wealth, but also coldness. There was no life there, only an empire built on control and power, and now she was part of that empire against her will. But if Alex thought he could bend her with contempt, he would learn the hard way that she was not an easy woman to break. When night fell, Rosanna decided that she would not be at the mercy of loneliness within that soulless marriage. She went to his office. The door was ajar, and the light from the lamp illuminated Alex's silhouette behind the desk. He was absorbed in his papers, frowning in concentration. Rosanna knocked on the door just long enough to announce her presence. He looked up, surprised, but quickly regained his impassive expression. "Lost your way?" he asked sarcastically. Rosanna entered and closed the door behind her. "I want to talk." Alex leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What about?" She kept her gaze firmly on his. "About this farce." Silence hung between them for long seconds. Rosanna approached the table and rested her hands on the polished wood. "If you hate me so much, why did you agree to this marriage? I could have refused." Alex laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Do you think you were the only side of the coin forced into this?" He stood up slowly, walking around the table, until he stopped in front of her. "Do you think I wanted to marry Henry's daughter?" Her father's name came out of his mouth like poison. "Then why did you accept?" His eyes became two dark slits. "Because this marriage gives me something I want more than anything: revenge." Rosanna felt a chill run up her spine. She knew that Alex despised Henry, but the intensity of that hatred was much greater than she had imagined. "My father did bad business. He lost money." Alex laughed again, this time more bitterly. "He didn't lose money, Rosanna. He destroyed lives." She blinked, confused. Alex looked at her for a moment before continuing. "Your father ruined the only thing that mattered to me. And now, as punishment, I possess the only thing he wanted to protect. You." Rosanna's breathing faltered. Was that it? Did he see her as a bargaining chip, a way of making Henry suffer? Her chest rose and fell with anger. "Do you see me as a punishment for him?" "Yes." Rosanna's heart squeezed. She clenched her fists. "Then make a mistake, Alex." Her voice came out firm, charged with fury. "Let me live here like a prisoner, ignore me, treat me like a ghost, because that won't break me." His eyes flashed with something dangerous. "We'll see." Rosanna left the office with the feeling that war had been declared, and she was ready to fight. The night was colder than usual, but Rosanna felt nothing but anger pulsing through her veins. Marriage was a sentence, a prison without bars, but she refused to be a victim. If Alex wanted a power game, she wouldn't be the weak piece on the board. The next morning she decided she needed a plan. At breakfast, she sat at the table and pretended to ignore his presence. Alex, for his part, seemed indifferent, leafing through a newspaper while sipping his black coffee. Rosanna observed the guards around the estate and memorized every detail. High gates, reinforced security, attentive drivers. If she wanted to escape, she had to be clever. The first step was to win the trust of the team. Days passed. She became the perfect bride in the eyes of the house. She smiled at the staff, chatted to the security guards, and feigned a tranquility she didn't feel. She knew that Alex was watching her, evaluating her every move, but he never suspected what was really behind her new behavior. On the third night, when the house was quiet, Rosanna snuck into the garage. She grabbed one of the service cars and drove in a hurry away from the mansion. Her heart was pounding, adrenaline burning through her veins. Every kilometer he covered was a victory. When he finally crossed the border of the estate, he felt the air enter his lungs like never before. He was free, or at least he thought he was. The news of his escape reached Alex before dawn. He was in his office when Max rushed in, his face full of tension. "She's gone." The glass of whiskey Alex was holding stopped midway. "How?" "She took one of the cars. She got through the gates without arousing suspicion. She planned it." Alex's jaw clenched. A wave of fury overwhelmed him. Why did this affect him so much? Why was that stubborn woman able to drive him out of control? He stood up slowly, leaving his glass on the table. "Find her." His voice came out low, but carrying a silent threat. Max nodded and hurried out of the office. But Alex didn't have to wait. He would go after her himself, and when he found her, Rosanna would learn that running away from him was not an option. The strong aroma of fresh coffee wafted through the small corner cafe where Rosanna was sitting. The sound of surrounding conversations formed a distant hum as she kept her eyes fixed on the cup in front of her. 5 years. 5 years since she had escaped from that prison. Now she led a simple life, far from the world that had almost destroyed her. But despite the freedom she had gained, something inside her had never found peace. Rosanna looked up when she heard a childish giggle. Her heart warmed at the sight of Jonas running between the tables, his dark hair mussed by the wind. The boy's innocent smile was her only certainty in life. Her only fear was that he would be discovered. And that fear became real the moment she felt a familiar shiver run down her spine. She looked across the street, and there he was, Alex. Time hadn't changed him. His gaze still carried the same intensity, the same coldness. But there was something different about him now. Something darker. The shock made her freeze in place. For a second, Alex also seemed paralyzed. But then he moved. He crossed the street with firm, determined steps. Every beat of Rosanna's heart was a countdown. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but it was too late. "Rosanna!" His voice cut through the air between them like a blade. She swallowed, forcing herself to remain calm. "Alex!" His name came out of his lips like poison. He looked away from her for just an instant. And it was in that moment that she saw him. Jonas. The boy laughed, oblivious to the weight of the reunion, but Alex wasn't oblivious. The color drained from his face. The silence between them became heavy. Alex's gaze returned to Rosanna, but now there was something else. Anger, understanding, and fury. "You ran away!" Alex's voice was a deadly whisper. Rosanna forced herself to keep her posture. "Yes." His eyes shone with something dangerous. "You hid it from me." She clenched her fists. "I did what I had to." Alex took a deep breath, as if trying to control the storm inside him. But what he said next made the ground disappear from under Rosanna's feet. "He's my son." It was a statement, a sentence. Rosanna's stomach churned. She pulled Jonas close to her, as if she could protect him from the inevitable. Alex stepped forward. "How old is he?" The question carried a dangerous tone. Rosanna pressed her lips together. He didn't need the answer. He already knew. 5 years. The same amount of time since she ran away. Alex's body stiffened. His fingers closed around his body. "You took 5 years off my son's life." Rosanna felt the silent threat. She had never seen him like this before, and that scared her more than anything else. The surrounding coffee disappeared. All that remained was Alex's gaze, burning into her. That changes everything. Rosanna's heart raced. She wanted to deny it, run away, disappear, but she knew that none of that was an option now. Alex wouldn't let it go. And for the first time since she ran away, Rosanna realized that she was truly trapped. The air between them seemed charged with electricity. Rosanna held Jonas tightly, as if her touch could protect him from the storm brewing in front of her. But nothing could stop her now. Alex's eyes were fixed on the boy, absorbing every detail. The dark hair, the eyes that reflected his own. Jonas was his miniature copy. And that was all the proof he needed. His voice came out low, controlled. "Let's talk." Rosanna nodded, her heart hammering against her chest. "There's nothing to talk about." Alex laughed humorlessly. "You hid my son from me for 5 years and you think there's nothing to talk about?" Rosanna swallowed. She knew this day would come, but she wasn't prepared. Jonas looked at his mother, confused. "Who is he, Mom?" Rosanna felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Alex held his breath. Then he took a step forward. "I'm your father." The world seemed to stop. Jonas's innocent gaze flickered between the two adults. Rosanna wanted to stop him, to push him away, to buy time. But it was too late. The boy frowned. "Are you really my father?" The childish voice carried genuine curiosity, without fear. Alex lowered himself to his full height. "Yes." Jonas blinked a few times, as if processing the information. Then he smiled. "Cool." Rosanna felt her breath catch. Alex smiled back, but when he looked up at her, his expression changed. "Let's get out of here." His voice was now a command. Rosanna clenched her fists. "I'm not going anywhere with you." His jaw went rigid. "I'm not asking." The conversation was cut short by the ringing of Rosanna's cell phone. She hesitated before picking up. "Hello?" The voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Did you think you could hide this forever?" The air disappeared from her lungs. Alex's eyes narrowed as he realized her reaction. Rosanna squeezed Jonas against her, feeling fear creep up her spine. "Who are you?" A low laugh came from the other end of the line. "The person who's going to rip everything out of you." The call ended. Rosanna remained motionless, her heart pounding. Alex didn't wait for an explanation. He approached her and took a firm hold of her arm. "What was that?" She was slow to answer, still absorbing the impact of the words. "Someone knows about Jonas." Alex's gaze darkened. His whole body tensed, his muscles tensing. "That changes everything." He pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. "Max, I want a team now." Rosanna's eyes widened. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Alex held her chin, forcing her to face him. "Do you want to protect our son or not?" She shivered at the intensity in his voice. She had no choice. Less than 15 minutes later, 2 black cars pulled up in front of the cafe. Rosanna felt her stomach turn. Jonas was excited, as if this were an adventure. She, on the other hand, felt caged. Alex opened the car door for her. "Get in." Rosanna hesitated, but the moment she saw a strange man watching them from across the street, she knew she couldn't risk it. She picked Jonas up and got in. Alex closed the door and gave the driver the order. The last thing Rosanna saw before the car drove off was that unknown man smiling at her. The threat was real, and now there was no turning back. The journey was silent. Rosanna held Jonas tightly against her, her eyes fixed on the landscape passing by the window. With every kilometer that took them further away from the city, her chest tightened even more. Alex was sitting next to her, his expression rigid, his fingers drumming against his leg. He was furious, but not as angry as she was. "This is a kidnapping," he muttered. Alex turned his face slowly, his voice laden with irony. "Kidnapping? Is that what you're going to tell me after stealing my son for 5 years?" Rosanna glared at him. "I didn't steal him. I protected Jonas from you." Alex's eyes narrowed. "From me?" His voice came out low, dangerous. "I'm the threat?" She crossed her arms. "You wanted to use me as revenge. Imagine what you would have done with a child you didn't plan." Alex laughed, but the sound was humorless. "I would never have rejected my own blood." Rosanna looked away. She wanted to believe that, but it was too late for trust. The mansion was exactly as she remembered it. Imposing, cold, full of secrets. As she got out of the car, she felt the weight of her imprisonment fall on her. Jonas, on the other hand, was dazzled. That house is huge. He looked around in awe, his eyes shining. Rosanna wanted to hate the fact that her son felt safe there. Alex approached and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Come on, I'll show you your room." Rosanna wanted to intervene, wanted to stop him, but Jonas smiled and took his father's hand without hesitation. Her chest tightened. She walked through the house alone, her footsteps echoing in the corridors. Memories surrounded her. The loveless marriage, the lonely nights, the silent wars. Nothing there seemed to have changed. Then she felt his presence behind her. Alex stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Where exactly did you think this escape would end?" Rosanna turned around slowly. "Away from you." His eyes flashed with a dangerous challenge. "You've never been able to stay away from me for long." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "That doesn't mean anything." Alex took a step forward. "No." There was something in his voice, an almost electric tension. "Then tell me, Rosanna, why are you shaking?" She clenched her fists. "What do you want from me?" He moved closer until the warmth of her body was palpable. "I want what has always been mine." Rosanna's heart pounded, but she didn't back down. Not this time. The silence was an invisible battlefield between them. Alex slowly raised his hand, brushing his fingers across the exposed skin of her arm. A shiver ran through Rosanna against her will. He smiled. "Are you afraid of me?" She raised her chin defiantly. "No." Alex tilted his head, his dark eyes dancing over her. "Then why can't you move away?" Rosanna opened her mouth to reply, but there were no words. Because he was right. And that terrified her more than any external threat. The night was silent. Rosanna sat up in bed, her gaze lost in the high ceiling of the room where she had so often felt like a prisoner. But now, something was different. Jonas was sleeping in the next room, peacefully, as if he had always belonged there, and she was more confused than ever. The door opened without warning. Alex walked in, closing it behind him. His eyes were intense, determined. "We need to talk." Rosanna sighed. "There's nothing more to be said." He took a step forward. "There's a lot to be said." She stood up, crossing her arms. "Then say it." Alex watched her for a long time before speaking. "I hated you." The confession made her heart waver, but he continued. "I hated you because you were a reminder of the worst moment of my life, because you represented everything I'd lost." His eyes shone in the dim light. "But I also wanted you." Rosanna held her breath. He moved closer until their bodies were almost touching. "I wanted you more than I should have, and that's what destroyed me." She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "What do you want from me, Alex?" He reached up and gently touched her face. "I want a chance." Rosanna blinked, confused. "A chance for what?" He held her chin, forcing her to face him. "To be a family." The air between them became heavy. Rosanna wanted to resist. She wanted to deny it. But how could she, when everything inside her was begging her to believe him? "I don't know if I can." Her voice came out in a weak whisper. Alex slid his hand down to hold hers. "Then let me try." She felt her eyes sting. Her walls were crumbling, and she didn't know if she wanted to stop it. Time passed slowly. Mornings at the mansion were no longer cold. Jonas and Alex became inseparable, and Rosanna realized something she had never imagined. Alex was a good father. Every laugh Jonas made, every admiring glance, every shared moment made a part of her surrender. And when she realized it, she no longer fought it. She no longer wanted to run away. One evening, Alex found her in the garden, looking up at the starry sky. He approached her, his voice low. "Are you still thinking about leaving?" Rosanna looked at him, then she smiled. "No." Relief shone in his eyes. And this time, when Alex held her face and kissed her, she knew. The past was behind them. Now they were a family, and nothing could change that.